So far we've been looking at the inheritance pattern of traits that can be found in what we call autosomes. So autosomes are any of the chromosomes in an organism that do not determine sex. So in humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? Chromosomes 1 through 22 are known as autosomes. They don't determine sex. They determine all the other characteristics that we have. But our 23rd pair are what we call our sex chromosomes, XX being usually female or XY being usually male. So if we have a trait that's on one of these X or Y chromosomes, that will have a different inheritance pattern depending on the sex of the child or the sex of the offspring that are produced than it would if it was on a normal 1 through 22 autosome, okay? And the reason why sex-linked traits have a slightly different inheritance pattern because these chromosomes are technically not homologous. So again, XX is usually female, XY is usually male. I say usually because there are exceptions to this rule. We cannot use necessarily chromosome combination as a definitive way to determine sex. And we can talk about that later, but so typically XX will be female and typically XY will be male, but there are exceptions to this. And because X and Y, these chromosomes technically have different genes on them that contain different information, they're technically not homologous chromosomes. So the X chromosome is much larger than the Y chromosome and it contains a lot more information. And there's no redundancy, so the genes on the X chromosome do not have any homologue on the Y chromosome. So the X chromosome contains a lot of genes, some of them which may be disease-causing, like ocular albinism, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, androgen insensitivity, but a lot of what the X chromosome dictates is the type of hormones that will be produced and developing, usually, if there's 2 copies of it, ovaries as opposed to testes. If the Y chromosome is present, though, this gene right here, this SRY gene, plays a big role in basically turning off the genes that are on the X chromosome that say to produce uterus and ovaries, right? If this SRY gene is present, it will turn off the genes to develop female type organs, and it will activate the genes necessary to produce male type organs, right? So because they have different genes, they're not homologous. So in people that have XY chromosomes, whatever is on that one X chromosome will be expressed. There is no second X chromosome in people that are XY to maybe, I don't know, have a dominant form of a gene to hide some of these recessive disease alleles, right? So because they only have one X chromosome, if they're XY, whatever's on that X will be expressed. So let's take an example of this, right? So we saw in that last image that ocular albinism is a trait that is found on the X chromosome. And ocular albinism is a recessive trait. And so what this disease is it impacts how pigmentation in the eye develops, and it actually leads to a decreased amount of pigmentation, or almost no pigmentation at all, which without pigmentation in our eyes and our irises, that really impacts our vision. And so people with ocular albinism typically don't see very well. Okay, it's a really, really hard disease to deal with. So if somebody has XX chromosomes, they need 2 copies of this recessive allele in order to express this disease, right? If this person, though, is an XY person, then they would only need 1 copy of that recessive ocular albinism gene on their 1X chromosome in order to express this trait, because there's no second X chromosome in people that are XY to potentially hide the impacts of this recessive disease. Let's solve a problem here, right? So would it be possible for somebody who is XX and somebody who without ocular albinism, so they don't have the phenotype of having ocular albinism, and somebody who is XY who also does not have that phenotype of having ocular albinism, to have a child that does have ocular albinism? Is this possible? Okay, so let's think through this, right? So an XX person without the phenotype of ocular albinism, could they still carry that trait of ocular albinism? Yeah, they definitely could. So we're going to denote this X0, this X0, as the X chromosome that has this ocular albinism allele, right? So if we're looking at a person that's XX but does not have the phenotype of ocular albinism, they could have two genotypes. They could be a carrier, meaning they have one copy of their X chromosomes, does have this gene for ocular albinism, but the other one doesn't. And so because this chromosome does not have that allele for ocular albinism, it would have the dominant normal eye pigmentation allele, then this albinism gene would be basically hidden. Okay, so they could be a carrier, but not present with the disease. Or both their X chromosomes would not have this ocular albinism allele, and they would be fine, right? And they would not be a carrier, they would not pass on that gene to their offspring. But if you're an XY person without ocular albinism, you do not present with this disease, the only genotype that you could have would be a normal X chromosome without that ocular albinism allele and a Y chromosome. Okay? So the only genotype that would be possible would be a normal X and a Y for somebody that has an XY chromosome. So is it possible then for two people who do not present with ocular albinism to have a child that does have ocular albinism? Let's take a look. So let's take this example if we have the XX person is a carrier. So X0, they have one of their X chromosomes has this ocular albinism allele, the other one does not. Remember, ocular albinism is a recessive gene, recessive alleles, that way it requires two copies. So they would make gametes with either the ocular albinism allele on the X chromosome for 50% of their gametes, or the other 50% of the gametes would have this normal X allele. And the other parent, if they don't have ocular albinism, they're XY, they have to have a normal X chromosome, and their other chromosome here would be their Y chromosome. So if we do this Punnett square, would any of these offspring potentially have ocular albinism? So here we go. So this X0 was inherited in this row from the mother, if she's a carrier, potentially. This normal X chromosome would have been inherited across here. Okay, so these individuals are totally fine. This would be potentially a female offspring that does not carry the disease and does not present with the disease. This would be a male offspring that does not carry the disease. Well, they can't carry, but would not present with the ocular albinism. But what about these ones over here? This box right here represents that there's a 25% chance that that these two individuals could have a child that is male, XY, and does have ocular albinism. Right? The 25% comes from, again, 1, 2, 3, 4 potential outcomes. One of those 4, or 1/4, 25%, would have ocular albinism, but they would have to be male, right? So there's 25% chance of all the children that these two have that they could have ocular albinism. But within the sons, if they have a son, right, if we just look at this row, if they just have their XY offspring, within that, there's 50% chance that if they have a son, that the son will have ocular albinism. What about this individual right here? What about this one? So this represents 25% chance of having a female child who is a carrier, meaning that this child, like their mother, will not present with the disease, but has that ocular albinism allele to pass on to the next generation. So this individual will not have ocular albinism, but could pass it on to their next generation, especially if they have a son, or if they have a child with an XY person that does have ocular albinism.